The crazy things that we did in the name of Jesus. Some of you guys may not be able to understand what we're talking about tonight, but some of us, we were a bit off. And so we're going to be talking about that tonight. So, Bob, welcome to the program.
Hey, good to be here. Good to be here.
Yeah.
I missed you last week. I had such wow, my neck was way off. And so it's good to be kind of back in service.
I'm glad that you're feeling better. That's wonderful.
Yeah. I'll tell you, my neck was, I slept on it wrong on like a Thursday night, and it took almost a week for the intense pain to die down. You know what I mean?
Right.
Wow.
Wow. That's tragic that, we have to go through that from time to time. And the older that we get, it seems like it happens more often than not. So
Well, I prayed to Jesus, but it didn't help.
strike one, strike two. Okay.
Try Joe Pesci.
Yeah.
Daryl, did you have a good Easter egg hunt today?
Well, I didn't even have to hunt them. They just showed up on my table a minute ago. They were actually those deviled Easter eggs. But tell you what, they're putting on a feed bag in there. It's pretty good stuff. Hey,
Yeah.
but I tell you what, I missed Bob last week. It's good to see you back, Bob. It's just not the same when you're not here.
Amen.
Thank you.
Diana, what's going on?
Oh, nothing too terrible much, Dr. Jones. Just got up from a nap a little while ago. I'd been up a lot of the night and was kind of tired, so I lay down for a couple hours. I'm also looking at the tracking information from the Chinese space station, if you've been reading about that one. It's supposed to re-enter today.
Oh, wow.
And
At what time, do you know?
nobody's quite sure where it's going to come down yet, so this ought to be interesting.
Sure. What size is it supposed to be when it hits?
Right now, it's the size of a school bus. Nobody's quite sure of how much it's going to break up, how many small parts there will be. There's likely going to be a rather large piece hitting somewhere with other little bits and pieces that burn off and fall off as it comes into the atmosphere. Maybe the largest piece might be as much as a ton.
Wow.
Nice.
Wow. One of the things that I am concerned about living in Pensacola has to do with the Blue Angels. They practice a lot, right over the studio and in this area, and I don't know why they can't practice over the water, but from time to time one goes down, and the same thing is true with a lot of these practice planes that the Navy, this is a Navy training facility at the Naval Air Station, and so they're training pilots, and they get to train right over our studio, and so it's rather scary from time to time. I wish they would fly out over the water, but maybe you have to have land to do some of the maneuvers. But I just know that we've had several accidents here in Florida, and so it's never good when they do hit in a neighborhood. But hopefully this will hit out at sea somewhere.
That would be very nice. There's a lot of water underneath this thing. The way the orbital track goes, it spends a lot of time in mid-Pacific, a lot of time in mid-Atlantic. Hopefully it's going to come down there and not bother anybody. And yeah, you mentioned the Blue Angels. I had the honor of seeing them when I was at the baseball game at Wrigley Field last year. They were flying over practice runs for the air show that was coming up later, and it was rather interesting. They were doing the diamond formations.
Right.
And got
There's-
quite a number of pictures.
One of them that flies, he's always there where I take my grandson for karate, and he's a very interesting individual, to say the least. Let's get right into the show, the crazy things that we did in the name of Jesus. Daryl and I were talking earlier about this, and I have to say that I've done some weird things, Bob. I mean, we're talking about things like a Jericho March. Have you ever heard of that?
No, no. What's a Jericho March?
Okay, well, Daryl's laughing. He knows a lot about this.
Yes.
I mean, in a Pentecostal church, a Pentecostal setting, what you have is the people will get up and they will start marching around and around the church. And one of the things that my father used to preach on was, how the walls of Jericho came down. After he went overseas and did some studies, he came back and he was convinced. I'm not saying that I am at all, but he was convinced that, quote unquote, God did not knock them down, but shove them into the ground. And so that seemed a bit weird, but it was his story. He enjoyed telling the story. Lots of people got excited, but what people would do in the Pentecostal movement, because I was both Baptist and Pentecostal at the same time, unfortunately, it was kind of weird, but
We call that Pentecostal.
Baptist, okay. I mean,
How do you do that?
well, it's strange. It's a Heinz 57. My grandfather, very successful. He's the guy who helped launch Oral Roberts and Joel Osteen's father, especially the Lakewood thing. I mean, my grandfather put him on the map. But my point is, there were strange things that people would do. And so they would march around and around on the inside of the building, and sometimes it would happen on the outside of the building. But I remember when my father was holding a revival in Minneapolis, Minnesota, the temperature was something like 10 or 15 degrees below zero, and we were still having service every night, believe it or not. That's tragic, but it is what it is. But people didn't want to just march, but it broke out into a Jericho run, and they started running around the building. I mean, we're talking about 150 people to 200 people running. Just, it's crazy. Daryl, tell some of your story, because I think that you've experienced some of that, correct?
So the Jericho March would be you were running around the outside of the building, and
No, I mean, this was on the inside. I mean, typically it happens on the inside of churches, but sometimes people go on the outside. I was at a coffee house doing a concert, and these people were super Pentecostal. I've never been in that vein. I have ministered in Pentecostal church, but technically I've never been.
there are not
So
a lot
wrapped
of
up in
Pentecostal
it.
churches here in Binghamton. There've been a few. I've never visited one, and the only Pentecostal churches I've ever been to in New York were over the edge and kind of part of the fringe populace, and so I never really knew much about what the Pentecostal movement was doing. The closest we came to that was we did have the Assembly of God was rather large here in Binghamton, but it was somewhat Pentecostal, but not.
Now the assemblies, that's very much Pentecostal. I mean,
Yeah, but I mean, they weren't as over the edge as some of the churches that went by the name Pentecostal.
correct. I mean, you have a variety within that system, but let's go back
Locally,
to-
I would say that the only thing that was unusual about the Assembly of God Church here was they just believed in tongues, speaking in tongues as a sign of being, sanctified or baptized in the Holy Spirit. And other than that, there wasn't really that much that I noticed was all that different about them here locally. So they were kind of a moderate, mild version.
Well, the big difference between the Baptists and the Pentecostals, the Baptists do not believe that you can lose your salvation. In other words, once saved, always saved in a sense. But Pentecostals, you have to do maintenance, and so you find a lot of rededication. You even have, in some churches, they teach that you can get justified over and over again, and so a lot of people are not familiar with the terms. To get justified, it's by faith, and so it's like being born again. Okay,
Yeah.
that's
Well, if
what
you're
they
a
mean by that.
Catecostal, that gives you, 9 chances?
That's a bit funny. That's a bit funny. But with these Jericho marches, several things happen, and I was going to tell you a story about what happened in Minneapolis, Minnesota. I was going to school there at the time. But what was going on there was a bit weird because the platform was this was a large church. You had 200 plus people running, not walking, but running. And this one gentleman, he was going around and around just incessantly. And the platform, the stage that is, it was some 8 to 10 feet off of the floor. And this guy, he went up the steps on the side of the stage, no banister, nothing that would be safe. But he just went around and around and around with his eyes straight up in the air. And he did it rapidly, just up and down, and did not fall. So that impressed a little kid like me. I mean, I said, wow, there must be something to that. And so it was fascinating to watch. But as a kid, when they started running, it looked like fun, and so I would jump out there and run with them. It was a lot of fun from time to time. And
So what other crazy things? I'm trying to think of some of the crazy things that I did. Things which I didn't think of as crazy at the time, of course, otherwise I would not have done them. But I mean, one of the things that I was really big at, having been to Bob Jones University and having been kind of tutored by Jack Hiles, as it were, there, to me, soul winning was the big thing, And so I used to go, door to door, knock on doors, go to, the mall, and I would, pass out tracts and talk to people and ask them if they were to die today, do they know where they'd be, And so I was really into that soul winning thing, and I had a number of tracks that I really liked, and I had them rubber stamped with my name and contact information, and I was really, gung ho with soul winning. And the other thing that I'd say that was really crazy, now that I look back on it, is I think this goes back to my childhood. Although my parents weren't overtly religious, and I was raised in an Episcopalian church, they never talked about religion. But when I became, a Christian and decided to experiment with fundamentalism, I really thought that it was my job as a preacher to make people feel like they deserved hell, and that I had to really get them good and lost before I could get them good and saved.
okay, give us an example of getting people good and lost. I mean, a lot of people don't know
I
what
would
that
try
means.
to make an argument, much like sinners in the hand of an angry God. I would try to convey the idea that mankind is so sinful and wicked that we are actually a foul stench in the nostrils of God. And if it weren't for the blood of Jesus, we would have been obliterated, squashed, and tortured long ago. And that there's just nothing good in the human heart until it is awakened by the Spirit of God, and that and consequently, I had arguments for how all of our kindness and niceness was really nothing but a facade and a cover up, and a Freudian disguise, and so that was basically what I was experimenting with, and I for a while I actually went into some deep Calvinism of the total depravity concept, but that lasted for me for about 2 years, and it stopped making sense to me. But mostly because it wasn't producing any useful results.
Daryl, share your thoughts on some of those crazy things that you got involved in, running around the church or whatever.
Well, one of the craziest things that I got involved in, and I was a part of a group where the preacher felt like he had a special anointing, special call on his life to teach, to get people to obtain joy. Now, if you're not a joyful person, if you went to one of his meetings, you had the opportunity to leave joyful. And he took some passages from Scripture very literally, and of course defined them in the way that he determined they should be defined. And for example, there's a passage that talks about dancing for joy. There's different passages that talk about sing for joy, and anything that had for joy after it was something that he would encourage people to do, to the point that he actually gave dancing lessons when to his congregation, and anywhere they would invite him to come and preach. He would sing songs about dancing for joy, and he would teach them how to do the dance that he had determined was, I think he may have even called it Holy Ghost dance. And that if you did this dance, you would get joy, because that was the formula. That was God's formula. In other words, to get joy, you dance before the Lord, and then he gives it to you. And, I look back on that, and I see that as pretty strange.
Was that anything like the scene in the Blues Brothers where James Brown was the preacher in the church and everybody's doing the whole gymnastics thing?
Yeah, very similar. And it's really, unfortunately, not all that uncommon. It is more of a Pentecostal thing than anything else, because, to me, when I think of any group of people that refer to themselves as Pentecostal or Spirit-filled or something along that line, anything associated with Spirit becomes the thing that you go after. And, these signs shall follow those that believe. Now, that's one thing stated before the fact, and then after the Holy Spirit was poured out in the book of Acts, then you have the gifts of the Spirit. Looking back on it now, it seems kind of strange that there was always more emphasis on the gifts, like speaking in tongues, prophesying, things that are listed, certain listings as gifts of the Spirit. It seemed like people were more involved and interested in that than what was called the fruit of the Spirit, which would have made more sense for the emphasis to be on it, because it's things like love, peace, joy, long-suffering, things that supposedly you get if you get this thing called the Holy Spirit or the Holy Ghost. It comes in the package. And unfortunately, you might see people, trying to speak in tongues or dance or do things like this, but they might not be all loving or kind, or might not be expressing the real evidence, which should be the fruit, that which the Spirit produces in a person's life. But anyway, that's just some of the things I was involved in. Looking back on it, these days, I think you don't really need to go through all that stuff to have these things. I think they're already there. You just have to discover them for yourself. We have, as human beings, the capacity to love. We can find means by which we can be joyful. I mean, we might get down from time to time, but we don't have to stay there. And I think there's a better approach than what we were trying to know.
I don't know that I ever had this, dancing for joy, but I did used to carry around a picture of my pride and joy to show people. Did I ever show you the picture of my pride and joy?
I don't think you did.
I can hardly wait.
Oh, yeah, I have seen that.
Yeah. So that's my pride and joy. That's my pride and joy right there. Yep.
I knew there was a catch, Bob.
Okay, here I am. I wanted to try to get Kerry, but he said, okay, he
other
said he
things
was
I
cooking.
experimented with. I tried to experiment with a couple of other crazy ideas, but it was really more of an experimentation. I was never really like latched onto the idea. But there's some people claiming that they were apostles, that they'd actually been personally commissioned by Jesus, and other people who believe themselves to be prophets. They're speaking, through the unction of the Holy Spirit. And I looked into that to see what I thought, and I finally came to the conclusion that God seemed to be never any more intelligent or just as stupid as the people who claim to be doing this, so I really thought this was a form of self-deception. So I didn't, I just couldn't latch on to that. But
Well, that's one thing that I can recall. As far as I'm concerned, it greatly hindered my growth and progress. Is that when you go the route of especially it seems like especially the Pentecostal route, when you ask for the Holy Spirit and supposedly there may be some kind of evidence that you have received the Spirit, then it's one of the definitions or one of the things that go with that term a lot of times is the spirit of wisdom. And so you begin to really learn the scripture and really learn what God wants and expects and etc. And that is your version of wisdom. And
yeah.
very, very limited.
And you know what also, I came to this conclusion very early on. I was coming out of fundamentalism. I think that fundamentalism only appealed to me, gave it a good try for 2 years. It started falling apart on me then moving more towards evangelicalism, I guess. But near the end of it, I even realized that it seemed to me that everyone's spiritual gift that they were claiming to have had more to do with some sort of unhealthy mental pathology they were involved in than anything I would want to ascribe to God. And I thought, and this was because I was actually, also studying psychology. And for some reason, a lot of people used to come to me for counsel, and they did that because I think there's this false belief that somehow if you're a minister, then you understand human beings and you understand God. And I don't know if I certainly don't think that's true. But when people would come to me, and I'd really try to make sure that if I had anything to say to them, that I knew what I was talking about. And so I really began to study, what I could learn from psychology and human development. Eventually, I actually went and I got a degree from a secular university in human development. So, but I found that the more that I studied that, the more that I just felt that the theology that I had been experimenting with was really very unhealthy, very unhealthy.
The stories you guys are telling remind me of how sedate my life was when I was growing up. The craziest I ever got was I was an altar boy. And I was an altar boy for several years, and I never got molested. I felt left out. Now, on the other hand, my late sister was became a full-on Pentecostal Christian. And she had the stories. She converted while she was living in Columbus, Ohio. And the church she belonged to, the congregants would go to the local Denny's for brunch after the service, and they'd be rolling around on the floor, slain in the spirit, I think she called it,
Right.
speaking in tongues. She never handled any snakes, to my knowledge, but knowing Anne, maybe.
Didn't you say that she wrote a song, Jesus, Jesus, Jesus?
Yes, she did.
Can you
The first
sing
I
a bit of
heard
that?
it-
Do you know it?
I don't know it, unfortunately. Those two played a CD of it when I was in Cleveland for my sister's funeral. And they played this song, and it was, how did I describe it in my reply to you? That vapid was really what it was. That there was nothing except full-on sycophantry here. I forget what the word is, but no mind to it at all, and it was sad. I mean, they loved it because that's what they had left of St. Anne. But I sat there and thinking, what the heck?
Right. Wow.
I started actually also reading the books by Nathaniel Brandon, who was a
boy.
tremendous critic of Christianity, but I really liked his books even when I was still preaching. You know, I read almost all of his books, and you know, he was a boyfriend to Ayn Rand.
I was about to ask, yeah, that is the guy then.
Yeah, right. Yeah. But, you know, and I don't think that his criticism of Christianity was really an understanding of it either. But I do think that the way he criticized Christianity is the way some people within Christianity understand it. And I think he had some legitimate criticism. But I thought that what he had to say about you know, his real focus was on you know, self-image and how it is we think of ourselves, and I really liked a lot of what he had to say, and then actually incorporated it into some of the ways I understood the sayings of Jesus. You know, so
Bob.
people didn't like me. What?
Bob, when you were going door to door, did you ever witness anything extraordinary during those days?
Not in the door-to-doorness. I mean, most of the door-to-door that I did was really just talking to people and, you know, going through the Romans road, or just, you know, showing them some scriptures and trying to give them a persuasive argument and hoping to have the conversation end somewhere just after I had gotten them to bow their heads and to receive Jesus as their personal Lord and Savior. So nothing extraordinary during those particular conversations. But, you know, there certainly were some unusual experiences from time to time that to this day I find myself saying, I don't know what to make of that.
Bob, you mentioned something a little while ago that brought back a memory of mine, and this would be in the category of a strange occurrence, you might say. In my younger days, my parents were involved in a stagehands union. So any production that would come to town that required stagehands in any manner, they would get a call and get a crew together to work. So needless to say, as a teenager, we would get to work these different shows that came to town. Well, there was one that came around pretty regular called the Ice-Capades. Anyone ever heard of the Ice-Capades?
Sure, yeah.
Well, we would run spotlights, we would be a stagehand, different positions, but usually no one wanted the position of wardrobe, because you had to help the people in and out of their costumes. And, you know, in those days, it was well known that all the dancers were gay. And here I was, a devout Christian, and so I got stuck on wardrobe this one particular year. And so I was handling it very well. I mean, of course, you know, I had my teachings and my understanding what this gay thing was all about. And so I was trying to think of a way to be a good Christian and be a witness to these men. And so you mentioned the tracts. What, the Chick publications? Is that the kind that you were in reference to?
No, I didn't care for the Chick publications myself, but mine were more verbal than comical, or, you know.
Well, this one wasn't so comical. This one was called The Gay Blade. And it was, you know, really putting down gays, of course, you know, and
Right.
letting them know they needed to be saved. And so I thought, okay, here's what I can do. And on the last show of the last night, when they were out dancing, I placed one of these in each one of their, where they dressed. And boy, did I ever stir up a hornet's nest.
I
But
can imagine, yeah.
something happened after that I find to this day was very interesting. One of the guys, very, very nice young man. I mean, he came to me and actually thanked me for doing that. And he said, you know, I was raised Pentecostal, and I know now. Don't get me wrong. I'm not agreeing with this person right now. As a matter of fact, I would have something different to say to him these days. But he said, I know that what I'm doing is wrong, that my lifestyle is wrong, and that I will most likely go to hell. He said, but it's the way I choose to live. And, but I appreciate your efforts to you know, and that you're showing that you care about me. Something along that line.
That's sad. Yeah.
Yeah, it really is. Because, you know, if I could go back today and say, look, guy, I'm the one that's wrong here. You know? But at the time, that was my thinking. That's the way I understood things. And I actually thought I was doing these people a favor.
Boy, it's funny. Chick Tract just came up in conversation. When I was in Southern Illinois to view the solar eclipse last year, I went to the Southern Illinois University campus. We had seats in the stadium there, and I had my car, my rental car, parked in the parking lot, and I was viewing the solar eclipse, and I was going to all the vendors' booths and everything else. And some hours later, when it was time to go back to my hotel room, I go to the car, and I see something in the door. And this is what it was.
Oh, no.
I still have the damn Chick Tract. It's a real Chick Tract. I don't know when it was written or published. I was looking for the date and I can't find it. I don't know if it was before or when did Jack Chick die? It was very recently.
Yeah, but
But I don't
many
know
of
if-
those tracks were published, you know, year after year after year. So they, yeah.
Yeah, I don't know if this one, I don't know if he died before August 2017 or not. I can't remember because that's when I saw the eclipse. But I thought it was the funniest thing to find this darn thing stuck into the door of my car.
Bob, let's try this, okay? Your method you practiced years ago, I want you to try that on Diana and see if she will get saved.
I don't know that I even, you know, I don't relate to that so much anymore. I don't know that I can even get into that mode, to be honest with you. But you know, and I'm pretty sure that we'd only end up laughing.
That's the point.
You know, I usually my first point would always be to try to establish a question, which was, you know, Diane, if you were to die today, do you know where you would be spending eternity? Do you know for sure?
I would be food for worms, to tell you the absolute truth. What's the line out of Hamlet? But
Yeah, you know, so I would try to then, you know, come up with some rationale to try to produce doubt that one would just cease to exist, given that. So I would try to, you know, well, look, you know, consciousness is something we don't understand, and blah blah blah, you know, what have you. So I would try to, you know, persuade a person that they're gonna spend eternity somewhere, you know. And then we'd start talking about, you know, for all have sinned and come short of the glory of God, and what have you. And I don't even remember all the verses I used, you know, but it was called the Romans Road. That was one of the strategies I used. There was a time when I used to listen to a Jack Hyles presentation on how he did this, because he really had it down to a pseudoscience. And you know, so that there was this very strong way that he went about it, and I would find that most of the people, I'm pretty sure that probably greater than 50% of the people that I led to Jesus were just going through the motions to get rid of me. Yeah.
See, I
Easy to
had
get rid of this guy by agreeing or something. You know.
I had a different understanding when I was in fundamentalism. That is, of how people were quote unquote saved, because if you study soteriology, most of the time soteriology is broken into three different things. That would be justification, sanctification, and glorification. And so if someone asked me, are you saved? I could say, I'm getting saved, which means it could mean, well, I'm in the process of being sanctified. I could say I have been saved, which means that I have been justified. Or I could say, well, I'm going to get saved one day, and that would typically upset a lot of Christians because they would want me to get saved right now. And what I was talking about was, one day I will be glorified. However, one of the passages that really caught my eye early on when I was a little bitty kid, I was reading, and I started reading the Bible before I can remember. I mean, it was just something that I was just inundated with day in and day out. But in 1 Corinthians chapter 1, verse 18, it says, "For the message of the cross is foolishness to those who are perishing, but to us who are being saved it is the power of God." The King James Bible, it reads this way: "For the preaching of the cross is to them that perish foolishness." And so in my mind's eye, I'm saying, whatever I say to an individual, it's going to appear to be foolishness. So in my mind's eye, I didn't think that I had the ability to make a persuasive argument or to even lead them through some kind of trail in the Bible that would save them, because everything that I would say would be almost like this is the product of a feeble mind. In fact, the word moria in Greek here means the product of a feeble mind. And so those people who were not, quote unquote, saved, they would, whatever I said to them, it was simply the product of a feeble-minded person. And so I didn't feel like I could get people saved, and that's probably why, one of the reasons why I hated altar calls and all of that stuff. I mean, it used to really embarrass me. Even when I was a little kid, when I would bring friends to church, the most embarrassing part of the service wasn't when people started running or falling out in the spirit, but it was when the altar call was given and you were made to feel so wicked and wretched and all of that. And I said, that doesn't make sense to so many of these passages. For instance, let me read a subsequent portion of this in 1 Corinthians chapter 2. Paul says this in verse 14. Let me see if I can see that without my reading glasses. "The man without the Spirit does not accept the things that come from the Spirit of God, for they are foolishness to him." And so in my little bitty brain, when I was a kid, I said, how can a person who is not saved, that is, without the Spirit, if you can't accept the things that come from the Spirit of God, for they are foolishness unto him, and he cannot understand them because they are spiritually discerned, that would imply that you would have to have the Spirit before you could get it. And so in my mind's eye, I felt as if people had to have the Spirit before they could receive or understand. And so I left that part up to God. And so in my mind's eye,
I
go
would
ahead.
use that verse to actually, if somebody thought that what I was saying to them was foolish, I would just quote that verse and say, it looks like we're on the right track here.
I've heard people do that. However, in my mind, I was convinced that if it were, let's say, a work of grace, that is His grace, His mercy, if this was something that could not be out of me, and that was really indoctrinated into me, because none of the salvation can come from me, not even my faith. And so this is why in Romans it says faith comes by hearing, hearing of the word of Christ. Therefore, it was something that was coming this way instead of coming from within. And so
I think that I had the Zig Ziglar approach.
okay, I get that. But the thing that confuses me, for the most part, a lot of scholars are where I was, that is, when it comes to salvation. that is in soteriology, because they are not trying to go out and witness or do anything like that. The only witnessing that they do is to simply proclaim a message, and they don't feel like the message itself saves anyone. But if you can grasp what's being stated, perhaps God is working with you to give you that ability by His Spirit. And so that's kind of where
So
I
you might
was
be
when I was a
looking for
kid.
people who are already primed by the Spirit, and by preaching the message, if they're responding, aha, there's one of the elect.
Well, it wasn't so much, back in my early days, and I'm talking about my childhood, it wasn't so much about the elect. It was like, unless God does this A to Z, whatever I do is in vain. And so I felt like I had to completely rest upon His ability, because I didn't feel as if I could save anyone or win anyone to Jesus. And so, as a person, even as a preacher, so many people would push me because I could preach very, very well. They would push me into saying, why don't you push it a little bit harder? You'll get a lot of people saved. And I said, I'm not interested in pushing people. If something happens in them, so be it. If it doesn't, so be it.
Wow.
And so
I was more influenced by myself. I started reading early on Charles Finney, and two of his books that I really, really liked was, number one, his Lectures on Revival. And I probably read that book through from cover to cover at least once every year. And also, I liked his book, Lectures on Systematic Theology. I probably read that book through at least, from cover to
Right.
cover once every year. And he, of course, was, before he became an evangelist, he was a lawyer. And so his approach and his concept was really based upon an attempt to come up with reasonable and rational arguments for his position. And so, that's what I tried to do. I really tried an intellectual argument. That's where I was coming from, and mostly because I myself related to an intelligent argument, which is unfortunately what also ended up undoing my theology. Because the more I started thinking about things and looking at things, I realized, well, this doesn't really make sense. So I can't do that. And by the time I finally left the ministry, I had changed my thoughts and ideas so much that I was actually upsetting people. And the main reason I left the ministry was not because I didn't have any faith, but was because my faith was so different that I was really just upsetting people. And I thought, well, I don't need to do that, so I'm going to go.
Interesting that you mentioned that, Bob, because a couple people tried to get me saved over the years. And one time I remember, first time at university, the guy was a rabid ex-Catholic. I was still nominally a Catholic. I was pretty much on my way out, but I was still hanging around because, well, I liked singing in the choir, and the organist was really cute. But he went into a full frontal assault with the cannibalism, the idolatry, the worship of the statues and all this sort of thing. And it just struck me badly. And I bristled at it. It amazes me how much I did, now that I'm no longer a Catholic. But just his approach actually turned me away from the whole thing.
Yeah. I can understand that. Yeah.
Oh, yeah, I think that's a big issue, is the way people are approached. Pretty much with anything, but especially when it pertains to something like that,
Now, I can understand why a young person, while you have yet to develop some critical thinking skills, while you're at an age where you think you've got a handle on everything, I think I can understand why a young person can be taken into fundamentalism or evangelicalism. But I actually have a hard time understanding how can a person who has gotten up in years, who's been dealing with this for a long time, how can they stay in it? And now, the reason obviously I'm asking that question because, being a person who felt responsible to be honest with the text, I found I couldn't continue to do that, and so it makes me wonder, and I don't want to demonize people, but I got to be honest with you. There's a part of me that wonders, do they really have critical thinking skills? You
Right,
know?
right.
I find myself wondering because, like when I listen to people like, what is it, John Piper, and I listen to some of Ken Ham, and I'm wondering, what are, you know, what are they thinking? What is it what is it that just doesn't get through to them? I'm not saying that they have to become atheists. I mean, I didn't, but to believe in this concept of an authoritative Bible and some sort of a certainty of theology, that just I just found that the more I was honest with myself, I just couldn't go there.
When I was in the seventh grade, that would be the year that I learned how to speak and read Greek. And I became quite fluent at a very early age, to say the least. And one of the things that would bother me, I would go to church. I would ask my father, my grandfather, and my cousins, my uncles, because I have so many people in the ministry in my family, all over the place. That is not just in one religion or one denomination. But I would ask questions in light of John chapter 6, verse 37, because the King James Version reads this way: all that the Father giveth me shall come to me. And I would ask questions like this. I would say, if you look at it in Greek, it's not as if he's saying all that the Father giveth me might come to me,
Right.
but shall. And there's a big difference between might and shall.
There was no
And so
question, right?
But
There was
yeah,
no
but
question.
my question, the premise of my question was, if you're looking at it through Calvin's eyes, you have only a handful of people who are the elect of God, whereas other people would argue, no, all of humanity would be construed as God's created children. Therefore, God gave all of humanity to the Son, therefore all will come. And this is where universalists are. And so I was struggling between Calvinism and universalism and Arminianism, not too much, because in Arminian theology, it's a theology of the will, that is, of human beings. And I was very much a person who understood early on that there was a little bit to this stochastic involuntarism. There was a lot to determinate issues. There's, of the brain. We don't typically choose what to believe. It's basically what we're surrounded with. I won't get into all of that, but this was a fascinating passage along with everything else that John had stated, because one of my first things that I did when I was in the seventh grade, I went through the book of John over and over again in Greek, and I found this to be an amazing read. It's a very simple read in Greek. It's about at a third grade level, by the way. And so when I started reading the book of Romans and subsequent books in Greek, I was fascinated with it. And then it was just, I got into Hebrew in that same year. And so it was very, very interesting, but it just led me down a trail of asking more and more questions. And I guess the point is, I think the thing that set me free from fundamentalism was actually becoming literate, that is, in Greek and Hebrew. I could not see any longer the validity of the English versions. I lost my faith in the translation models, and I lost my faith in what man was telling me was the truth, and I just gradually just started letting go. And so I said, I became, in a sense, panicked because I didn't know what to do. I said, I'm reading this stuff. I can speak the languages. I can get into it, and it's so simple. And so I kept going this place and that place trying to find answers. And people are simply saying you're asking questions that are much too difficult. And so that's a problem. And people need to understand that in church, you don't go very deep. And,
Right.
and it doesn't matter who you meet, that is, in theology, the substance isn't very deep. And this is why, just out of curiosity, we don't mind going deep into theology. We don't mind going deep textually. And when we hear Bart Ehrman
I
debate,
wanted to go deep. Yeah.
yeah, but my point is, Bart Ehrman, he does a fantastic job, and I love the guy, but he rarely goes deep into the Greek text, and others, they rarely go deep. If they would ever go deep, it would, I think, produce a yield, that is, for the people who are listening to them, that I think they would lose their confidence to a great degree in that we really don't have all the things that we need to actually reconstruct what the intent was of these various authors. And this is why I keep saying that a lot of this stuff is very, 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 many
Now, I
people are
looked
just
at
very
I looked at
incompetent.
Calvinism very early on. I was probably 19, 20 at the time. I really looked at it only because a lot of people were telling me I should. But I'd already really read Charles Finney's concepts of systematic theology. He certainly was not a Calvinist, but he was not Arminian either. And I think that I tried Calvinism because it struck me as being the Calvinist I knew struck me as being more educated, more intelligent than the people who were more Arminian in their theology. But I finally came to the point where what I felt that Calvinism was really nothing other than Greek philosophy, shoehorned into the biblical text. And I thought that the Arminian theology I was hearing was really nothing other than a kind of a Greek rebellion against it. And I came to the point where I thought both of them made no sense to me in terms of a book that I felt really came from a culture that was not embracing Greek philosophy, So I found that early on, I couldn't go in either direction there, So
There was a comment made, let me read this. Piper and MacArthur know a little Greek and Hebrew. And that just means that they are wrong in Greek and Hebrew as well as English. Well, I do agree with your point.
yeah.
MacArthur,
John Piper knows a little Greek. The guy's like 5'2",
here's my opinion of both. MacArthur is a commentator, and typically commentators are the ones you want to stay away from. I'm serious. They take a theological approach toward linguistics, and it is poor. What they do is they will look at, let's say, the Greek text, and they will theologically drive the text rather than trying to establish, let's say, what the author might have meant. So they really don't care. And so they're very slothful, and I wouldn't give you 50 cents for the majority of the commentators out there. And it's sad. I mean, commentators like MacArthur are a dime a dozen. These guys, they actually get people who know a little bit about this and that to actually put their works together. They typically know very little about the substance that's been written in their name. Piper, I think he's a little bit better with the text than MacArthur. However, I think that I think much like Aaron Ra has bought into marketing atheism, and so his faith, that is, in the atheistic sense, is driving him. And I think that he's not going to back away from it, and so I think that's where Piper is, much like Aaron Ra. But I love Aaron Ra, and this is the thing that needs to be understood. I've got a lot of pastors who I'm very good friends with, and they're Pentecostal. Lots are Baptist, lots are of different faiths. I even have lots of rabbis who are friends and all of that. And I'm not going to disparage them, but I will say something in disagreement with what they spin, because I know why they spin what they spin, and it's in the name of their faith. And this is why I'm saying I think that atheists need to take another look at where they are, because so many people are saying this is just lack of belief, and they really don't understand that anytime that you form an opinion, like on the question, this is not an issue, someone makes a claim and you deny it. This is an issue of, is there a God or is there not a God? And so if we look at the question of God in a serious manner, and we form an opinion, if we have a viewpoint, whether it be, yeah, there is a God or there isn't a God, that opinion, that stance, that position, that mindset, that viewpoint is very much a belief set. And so when people say that they don't have belief when they are an atheist, they're conning themselves. Don't trust me. Read philosophy, lots of books. And just go to, online and Google things. Get on a Stanford site of philosophy, and you'll find out that what I'm saying is true. And this is why it really bothers me, because when you start taking a position either theistically or atheistically, these are the kinds of beliefs that you really have very little justification, if any, for. And so it's more or less like blind faith. And so you're leapfrogging from saying, I don't know, I'm suspending judgment, and now someone's asking me the question. And so some people leap over to theism, some people leap over into atheism. And I'm saying that both are leaps of faith. And so when people tell me that they don't have faith and they are an atheist, I don't think they have read much. And so ask, serious people who actually deal with the mind. Cognitive scientists will tell you that we very much have faith in what we sense. And we have faith in a lot of things that really don't make sense. But this is just a natural function. It's a cognitive operation, by the way. And so just thought I'd throw that in. But when it comes to Piper and MacArthur, the kind of Greek and Hebrew that they do know, these are synthetic models of the language. They can't speak the languages. They can only, when they read a passage, they will parrot back an English version. It's not like they have a working knowledge of the language. And so when you hear Bob and I talk, since we do speak the language and read the language and are fluent in it, the point being is that we can discuss it in a manner that makes sense, like we discuss what we say in English. And so it doesn't come out the same way when you hear these pastors, because it's a parroting contest. It's sad.
An interesting read, the commentary on the Book of Revelation by Jack Hyles.
Sad.
I don't know if you ever read it. It is as bland and as. By the way, there was a time when I was really a fan of Jack Hyles, just because he was a tremendous soul winner. In fact, there was actually a time when I hung out with his son Dave Hyles. He was going around to bookstores here in the Binghamton area, and he unfortunately went down a dark path. But but I was really more into the effectiveness of Jack Hyles. But as a theologian, the guy had. He didn't have a mental muscle for that at all, or for commentary. But, we're talking about some of the silly things that we did. And I think that it's a good thing that we recognize that some of these things we did were rather silly, but it's a part of growing up, so
Sure.
I'm not ashamed of having been silly. I'm not ashamed of having, given it a good try. At least now that I have walked away from a lot of that. I walked away from it knowing that I looked at it from the inside. I didn't just look at it from the outside. I gave it a try, found I couldn't do it. And I found that when I tried to walk away from it, I couldn't do that either. So I found that I went into that more of that agnostic, suspending of judgment, and and certainly altering a lot of. I left the world of dogma, but So I'm glad that we kind of came around and stopped being so silly. And I'll tell you what, part of the result of that is I can actually have a meaningful conversation with a person who is very much a Bible believer, and I think I can also have a meaningful conversation with a person who is absolutely not a believer at all. And I think I can enjoy where both of them are coming from, and I feel like I can understand how they feel, how they think, and actually respect it, and to a degree, so long as they're not going to get. You mentioned Aaron Ra. We like that guy an awful lot.
We love the
certainly
guy. Yeah,
disagree
super
with him.
guy.
But what a wonderful person. I'm so glad we got to know him, and we've enjoyed his presence with us here when we've had some chats, because he's just a wonderful guy.
Yes.
So what's not to like?
About Aaron, thank you, Bob, for taking us back a step or two, because what I wanted to mention was, one thing to remember is that where Aaron is coming from, if he's listening, I hope he doesn't mind my speaking for him, because I think I'm trying to do it accurately. The tack he's taking, the tack Silverman is taking, is largely political. It's against what hard right Christians are doing here in the U.S. to civil rights, to education. And that tack doesn't necessarily involve, or you might not even be able to take a deep study, because number one, you don't have the time for it. Number two, your audience isn't receptive to it. So that may be part of the reason for that.
Sure. Well, when we had David Silverman on here, he even said to us that one of the reasons why he was pushing for this monument that they put up was because not that he really wanted these monuments up. He was just hoping that people would say, "Let's stop doing all these monuments." We don't need to be doing this. And of course, I love what George Carlin said. You don't want the Ten Commandments in a courtroom or in a place of legislation, because it creates a hostile working environment.
Now, okay, let me be
I
clear.
have to move along here soon, so.
Okay, let me be clear about Aaron Ra. I love Aaron Ra to death, and he knows that. He's been here in the studio in Pensacola. We've walked all over the place and enjoyed life together. So when I make statements about where he is, what I wish for him, I wish he would leave this.
Pistivism,
This craze with this overreaching in the context of atheism. I wish he would leave that alone and start dealing rationally, that is, with theology and where people are in theology, because if he did so, I guarantee you he would gain so much respect in the theological community, it would open many more doors for him, because he's a very intelligent person, very kind person. He's bold. He will use his elbows to get in. He's up in your face. I like his style. That's why I say I love him to death. But I wish I could see a change, because taking this epistivist position, that's been crazy. That's not good for him. And so I would like to see some things change, and perhaps he could nuance some things where I need to change and become better in some things. And so that's what I mean by it, Diana. Does that make any sense?
Yeah. What I'd really like to be able to see is the kind of thing that you're doing on a larger scale, more people willing to listen, because going after people with a stick is likely to turn many of them away. I
Right.
understand this. And getting people to think about it gets them to think, which is a good thing, gets them to learn, which is a very good thing. A gentle approach may be a good way for a lot of people. I don't know that the hard right evangelical crowd is going to go for it. We may still need to be a little more severe with them. I'm hoping that we can just last through these next couple of years with the direction things have taken, and then maybe try to turn things back again.
But let me suggest this, and this has to do with a passage in the Bible concerning Abraham. And this is Paul explaining a conundrum that Abraham was going through. You will not see this in any extant English translation. But in the Greek, you find that Abraham, according to Paul, he's wavering. He has unbelief. He's wrestling with that. And he's empowered by faith at the same time. And so this is the conundrum that Bob keeps talking about that he's in, that there's this thing that's going on. And this happens in a lot of people's lives. And Paul is admitting to this. And in that, this is why he's not trying to present a better theology. He's not trying to say, well, I grew up in Judaism, now I want you to become a Christian. That's not what Paul's doing. He's simply saying that here's why we should deconstruct Judaism. Where we should take it from here, I don't know. Why? Let's analyze Abraham. He was struggling, yes, with unbelief. And yet he seemed to be empowered. And so why can't we struggle along with this model of Abraham? And that's exactly what he was doing. He was trying to throw juxtaposition there, because inwardly we have to say that anytime that we're dealing with, let's say, a thought experiment, we are wrestling with it a bit, correct? And so we're tossed
Yes.
to and fro a bit. And this is where so many people, especially people who are multi-axial, they will say, well, if we take and look at it from this vantage point or from that vantage point, you're not going to have the same outcome. And that's the point of suggesting, let's create models instead of taking positions. And so linguists, they create models all the time, let's say of Koine, but they're not trying to take a position. Well, dekauthensis has to mean this. This is not what you hear in the linguistic community. They will provide a model, they will provide a method, and they will say, well, don't park it there. We're trying to do much, much better because we've got so many other things that we need to analyze, and our work is not over. And so a lot of people are pretending like, when it comes to the God question, we've already settled that, let's go to the house. And so they choose atheism or theism, and that's absurd. We haven't even started to approach this question. This question, I don't even think that we are articulate to the question. And so my point is,
Paul,
go ahead,
Go ahead.
Bob.
Paul found his encounter on the road to Damascus arresting,
Yes.
and he developed a lifestyle of continuous arresting.
It's good.
He wanted to constantly be interrupted and perhaps thrust further into the mysteries of life. To him, deeper was not more certain, but to discover, I'd never seen this before, or this is even better than what I had been looking at yesterday, things like that. I do have to move along.
Okay.
But anyway, I enjoyed the discussion. Hopefully, we're not as silly as we used to be. But I'm hoping that in 10 years from now, we might actually look back at some of the things we think and actually be a bit amused.
I agree with you. We're not going to be but a few more minutes, but Bob, you take care. Call me this week. Love you.
Very good.
Take care. Okay.
Have fun.
Carrie Todd says, said something that I agree with. I would like to see less attempt to change other people and more evaluation internally of one's own worldview by way of hearing about others. In other words, this is good when we can sit down and have conversations and spend the time to drill down, because when I'm speaking with you, Diana, when I'm speaking with Daryl, this is surface language. And it takes time to develop a relationship to where you can drill down and understand the deep structure. And so surface structure versus deep structure. Up here, you're hearing words. What do I mean by them? It takes time to figure that out. You've got to tease that out. And that doesn't happen overnight. And this is why I'm not so for the great debate. I'm not even for debates in general, because typically it's, politician number one and politician number two, and they're not doing anything but trying to politically persuade people instead of getting into the data. And from time to time, you will see some people get up there and do some good, and you do see some agreement in some cases. But I think that we need to see more conversation, so I would agree with Carrie on this. Do you guys have any other comments to make before we end the show?
Well, I guess I'm kind of grateful for the position I'm in. I'm not on the front lines in the battle here in the U.S., so I get a chance to go deep, or try to go deep. And I'm thanking you, Dr. Jones, for introducing me to that. You get a new understanding or a new view on what these people might have been trying to say, without having to worry about how the education system is getting destroyed, at least while you're doing what you're doing, and how civil rights are being denied, how people are being excluded. I mean, I have to worry about that eventually, but at least in the comfort of my own studio here, I can take the time. And I wish more people were able to. It's a very hard battle now here. And I'd like to see some progress made there, so maybe people can let up a little bit.
Right. You've heard of John 3:16, correct?
Oh, yes.
Okay. Now, John 3:16 isn't about if you believe you go to heaven, if you don't, go to hell. What it is in the text, it's an indication that someone has made an assessment of a current reality of a handful of people. In other words, it's target sensitive, it's time sensitive, and you're dealing with participles. Participles in Greek need to be understood. These participles are playing the role in John 3:16 to give the reader, or the people hearing this, that is through the language of John, a chance to see that perhaps Jesus had concluded, that is, that some people were here and some people were there. And so he's trying to lift people out of condemnation. And he's going to make some powerful statements after verse 16. But prior to verse 16, he's dealing with Nicodemus, one of the most brilliant men of all of Israel. He's a teacher. He's a scholar. And yet he doesn't get the metaphor that Jesus is using. And my point in stating this, it's because the church world has been deceived into thinking that for God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten Son, that if you would only believe in him, you would have eternal life. That is a con job. That is not John 3:16 in Greek. That is a con job of the church. And so when I hear atheists taking the con job of Christianity from the book of Genesis all the way through the book of Revelation, and they talk about it in an English sense, I'm saying that's not where these people were. In other words, John, the writer's not talking about what they're preaching down at First Baptist And I understand Aaron Ross trying to, probe, question the theology of people at First Baptist. I get that, and I can understand why, because these people are trying to say turn or burn. But I keep hearing things like this, and I'm talking about, I had so many followers of Aaron Ra say to me this week, the Bible's all bullshit. It's flawed. It's just full of errors. And that's such an unmeasured approach to where these people were and how they had to put together, let's say, documents. The Old Testament, even though it's written in abjad form, it was written on stone. It was written on bone and animal hide. If you want to talk about a difficult write, W-R-I-T-E, that's difficult to do. And so when you have to preserve that, that's very difficult to do. Is it written in a form that is accuracy based? It wasn't intended to be that. It was intended to be a creative process. And so when you study the Abjad and you study what the Jews were doing with this, you're going to find out that what Jesus was saying isn't anything new. In fact, a lot of the Jews had been saying the same thing that Jesus had been saying for a long, long time. But when you go back into the Old Testament that was provided by the Catholic Church / Protestant Church, all being Catholic, you're going to get a distortion of the reality of it. And one of the reasons that, the Greek was applied, that is, in trying to say we need a Greek version of the Old Testament, it was trying to say, listen, we've been dancing and dancing and dancing and debating, and so if you want to get technical about this, this is one rendition, but they could have written and pinned out this thing various different ways in Greek, and all would have been right because the Abjad allowed for that. But that's not what I'm hearing from an Aaron Ra concerning the book of Bereshit, or better put, the book of Genesis. He's taking the narrative of a Ken Hovind. He's taking the narrative of an Eric Hovind or a Saitian Bruggencate, and these people don't know what's there. Do you get what I'm saying? They don't know what's actually in the text itself. They only know what they're reading in English, and they are interpolating it. They are reading into it. They are eisegeting the text for their own marketing system, if you will. Now, I don't know why Aaron would not simply sit down and say, let's go over some of this stuff, because I'd like to counter not just their craziness in one sense of the word, but I would like to challenge them textually. Do you get where I'm coming from? Because these people are textually wrong.
Yeah,
So-
and that is what I would like to see.
Because Ken Hovind,
because-
all of the stuff that he spends about biology, it's not good stuff. But when you compare it to what he's saying about the text, it's not good stuff. And so he's neither right in biology nor in textual analysis. And so that should be the end of the story.
Yeah,
but-
it should.
But what Aaron Ra is doing, he's trying to approach the one without the other. And I want Aaron to say, hey, approach both, and it will make sense. And I think you agree with that. And so hopefully maybe we can help Aaron a bit, because I love the guy. I mean, he's a wonderful person. If you've never met Aaron Ra in person, you need to. He's a wonderful guy. He's not trying to be disingenuous about anything. He's a bit hard-headed when it comes to lexical theory. But, are we not all that way? Isn't that true, Daryl?
I don't know. I don't know everybody, but probably. But I was sitting here thinking about, we started off talking about our experiences and the craziness of some of the things we've been involved in. But so Bob made a good point. At the time we were involved in them, they were very serious to us, and that's what we knew. That's as far as we had been able to get. And that does help in approaching people, in the approach we take if I consider where I've been in the past, I should be able to consider where people are today. And, you know, there should be some patience there should be some consideration in the way that I may try to approach anyone. But I did want to say this, that, I mean, in my experience, there was a time when I thought I had given my heart to the one who created all things. And as a result of that, he came into my life, and this secured my future. It gave me something to look forward to each and every day, and then at some point, I was told that there was more to it. I needed to receive this gift of the Holy Spirit, and this would enrich my life. And so, I made an attempt at that. And in every case, it seemed like something was going on to me, and it may have just been in my mind. But spent a lot of years, as I look back now, that could have been better spent in any number of ways. But I'm saying all that to get up to the present time in my own experience. And that is that where I am now, out of all the experience that I've had, this is by far the best. To realize that I can take an honest look at things and take an honest approach.
Good.
And be honest not only with myself, but with anyone else I meet.
Sure.
And at least reflect on the way I see many of my experiences now, but mostly to see and to realize that I can move forward. I can
Sure.
question, and I can, along the way, get some answers and live a much richer reality. And as far as I'm concerned, have much to look forward to in my future.
That's good stuff. That's good stuff. Okay, Diana, what are your final thoughts? I mean, are we doing the right thing? I mean, we don't have very many people watching this program, but if I get on one of these radicals, the numbers go way up. What's going on?
Yeah, I was writing about that in response to one of your posts. The feeling I get is that people like adversity. They like to see a battle, and I think that's why the popularity of shows like The People's Court, the Judge Judy, is so great. I'm going to be honest, that adversity is what hooked me on NCG. I was looking at Aaron Ra videos a couple of years ago, and one of his appearances here was one of them, and the banter that went back and forth was very appealing, so I kept looking for more. And of course, I came across that show that will live in infamy, the one with Silverman, Saitan, and Eric Hovind. But once I got hooked, I stayed because I liked what you were doing on the off hours, if you will, aside from all that adversity. There's a lot to be learned here. I'd like to see more people become interested in that and stick around for what you call the boring stuff, which I don't find boring at all.
But I mean, on that,
those formats.
I mean, in brief, Eric Hovind and Saitan Bruggencate have no clue as to what the various theories of knowledge are all about. When they started talking about justified true belief, when it comes to the theories of belief, the models of belief, they don't know anything about doxastic venture and all of that. They're clueless. When it comes to truth, they don't know anything about correspondence theory of truth. They don't know anything about coherence, models or theory of truth. They don't know anything about the consensus model or the deflationary and so on. I could name many, many, many more. I'm not saying that people have to be in the know concerning all of these, but I'm simply saying that if you're trying to push or market knowledge, that is as justified true belief, and you're trying to push presuppositionalism in the manner in which they are doing it, you should at least know the basics. And when I asked him questions about syntagmatic and paradigmatic analysis, which technically those are the two axes of language, he even tried to define these things in his book, and he did poorly. I mean, he's still at a loss. I mean, even after putting this into book form, he still doesn't have a clue as to what I was asking him. That just shows, the kind of ignorance that we're dealing with. I'm not trying to disparage him, but this gentleman is trying to market. He's trying to market an ism. And the same thing is true for the most part in the atheistic camp. And I wish people would let go of atheism and theism. Just let go of it. If you're an atheist and you find yourself there, fine, but don't be so obsessed with it. Let it go. Let it go. And discover there are so many different models of God. There are so many different models of not God. There are so many things to look at. You would be wise to just let go maybe for a year and just rethink everything. It would be marvelous if people would put what they think to be true concerning the question of God on the shelf, take a breath of fresh air, relax for a moment, and approach it. And first deal with the question. And I'm trying to get people to do that because I think a disciplined approach to the question will produce a much better outcome for everyone. What are your thoughts on that?
I am in full agreement. I really am. It's just so sad that we have all the fires to put out while trying to get on that road to the more disciplined approach. With Ms. DeVos as Secretary of Education, for example, trying to destroy the public education system with that totally flawed view she's got. I mean, it's garbage.
Okay, but let me play the devil's advocate for a moment. She's from Michigan, correct?
I think so. Yeah, it's up around the Great Lakes.
Okay, now the Christian Reformers, are you familiar with them?
Not as well as I'd like to be.
Okay, the Christian Reformers are, they're a very old church here in America, and they are very good in academics, by the way. They believe in classical training. Classical training is much different than you see in the public school system. And what she's doing, I think she wants monies to go toward, if you have your child is in, let's say, school A, and this happens to be a school that's being umbrellaed by the Christian Reformers of America, okay? She wants money to go there. In other words, if we're throwing all of our money just at the public school system, that might create a problem, and I think it is in America. Let's look at it like this. In classical education, it's divided into three parts. You go through what's called the knowledge provision years. In other words, little kids are sitting around, 2 + 2 = 4, and 2 + 3 = 5, and so on and so on. And so they are provided with a lot of knowledge, and then they go through the logical years. They get into the logical phase. In other words, now that we know this, we've been provided knowledge, now we need to tackle logic. How do we look at this? And so they're taught logic so they can deal with the substance that they've been taught, and they deal with it in a manner in which they start asking questions, which is good. And number 3 is after they go through the logical phase in classical education, then you have the rhetoric portion of it, where they learn how to speak and write sufficiently to what they can logically ask questions about. Does that make any sense? So you have the knowledge provision, you have the logic and then you have the rhetorical or the rhetoric. Do you see where I'm coming from?
Okay, that ideal sounds a lot better than what I dealt with when I went through the Catholic school system.
But the Catholic school system is not based upon classical education. It's
Okay.
more like public school. Now, in the state of Florida, all public schools are ran according to scope and sequence. And the scope and sequence that they do use here in the state of Florida is so that you will pass an exam at the end of the year. And so they are producing parrots, not thinkers. Whereas in classical education, you're taught, that is, the knowledge provision years, you're parroting a lot. But now you're entertaining logic. In most classical schools, not all, but these individuals go through extensive training. Lots do much work in Latin, French, and even Greek. And so if you can teach children at a very young age who are English-only students, if you can teach them inflected languages, this is going to give them a greater comprehension of their own language, number one. It's going to give them different vantage points, and so they do take a multi-axial approach. And so the advantages of shifting money from public schools over to these other school systems, it could be a great advantage, and DeVos is very much about that. I'm not a big fan of her, nor am I a Trump fan, but I do know that the state of Michigan, in the private sector, that is in classical education, they've got a good thing going on. Hello?
Okay, the ideal I can go with. It does concern me a little bit. I mean, I'm going to bring my favorite topic into the area here. Where it sounds like she's trying to walk back on rights for trans kids, for example. I mean, let the kids be who they are, and then they can learn.
Well, I don't disagree there. Now, when it comes to the Republican side of things, it's kind of like this. If you have a president who is, let's forget Trump for a few minutes. If you have a president who is liberal, a lot of the things that are done simply because you have a Republican president and you have a Republican, Senate for the most part, and also Congress, that person is going to be tarnished with all of those right-wing models or mindsets, correct?
Yeah,
Okay,
absolutely.
now, I voted for Obama, and I was proud to vote for Obama, but he was tarnished with the hawkish mindset of Hillary, the Clintons. Now, Obama going in, he wasn't a hawk. He wasn't for the invasion of Iraq, and yet all of that seemed to shift. And now he's doing all of these drone strikes. Just look at the history of what took place during the Obama years. Now, I don't attribute that to Obama himself, but I'm simply saying that there are a lot of hawks within the Democratic Party that impose that. And the same thing is true in education. You can't just broad stroke and think that all Christian schools are just all messed up. They're not. A lot of these Christian schools are very, very well disciplined. And I would challenge people in public education to get involved in seriously studying these schools that train children classically. It's one of the best educational paradigms that one can be involved in. I used to be involved in education on many different levels. I taught Greek and Hebrew for many, many years, and so I won't go into all of it, but my point is I've dealt with classical schools. I know the ins and outs of these school systems, and I know how they challenge the very fiber and fabric of public school systems. And what's failing in our public school systems, it's that we are satisfying the lowest common denominator. That's not so in a classical school.
Okay, okay.
Do you see where I'm coming from?
I can
And
go
so,
with that.
that's the thing that I'm, concerned about. A person can say, yeah, we're going to take money out of this school system. Now, the way that it works, because I was actually a chancellor of a school, and we were taking lots of money out of the public school system because this was a private school. And for every student that we took out, they were losing thousands of dollars a year. Now, we took some lower grade students and tested them up against their 12th grade best students, and they outperformed them 10 to 1. I mean, it was incredible. And they came to me and they said, how are you doing that? I said, we're doing this through classical methodologies. And so I used to be a big fighter in the educational processes, and so I don't know. I'm not going to get into all of that, but my point is, this was it was an easy win. In other words, people would come to me because so many people in the public school system, so many people are, they're falling through the cracks. We even had one kid, he checked in. He was a 10th grader in the public school. He could not even read. Could not read. And what did I do? I said, we can fix that really quick. And so we became what? Student focused. We focused in on where they were, and we tried to take them from A to Z as quick as we could. And so it wasn't scope and sequence. Everyone takes the same thing, and you do the same thing every year. That's not what we need. We need teachers who are competent to deal with students as individuals rather than just a group, a herd, if you will. And our public school systems are more or less dealing with students as if they are in a herd. You can't do that.
Now,
Kids are
could
developing.
you get there?
I beg your pardon?
Now, could you get there by taking another tack, by improving the public school system, trying to bring it, if not to the same level, to at least closer to this ideal classical education you're describing? One of the problems that we have is that the private schools are expensive, and a lot of people can't afford that. All they've got is the public schools. And if you take money from the public schools, they have less and less. Their performance goes worse and worse, and you're really not getting to where you want to go.
Okay, let me see if my monitor went off. I tried to turn it back on. Hold on for a minute. Can you guys talk for a second? I'll be right back.
Yeah, sure. Okay, I see that. Yeah, the camera's on me now, because a second while I cough. I mean, I look at the schools in the neighborhood I moved from, and they're hardly schools. They are more like prisons, actually. The kids there are not learning all that much. There are the gendarmes everywhere just trying to keep order. And a lot of that is because they have absolutely no money to work with. That's not the only problem, I'll grant you. But could it be possible that with better funding to provide better education, could the public schools be made better, and then for everyone, rather than those who have the pesos to send their kids to private schools?
I would have to say absolutely to that. I mean, you can't do anything in a quality way without the funding to do it with. For one thing, you can't attract good teachers, because a good teacher is one who cares about the students and has a desire to move them forward, to be able to teach them. But if a teacher has a choice of going into a facility where they can't even earn enough to make a living and won't have the financing to provide them what they need to do their job, they're going to look somewhere else. And so, you're going to get the ones who maybe can't get a job somewhere else because they're just looking for a job. And, the quality is just going to steadily go down.
The new teachers have a heck of a problem.
Right.
Number one, they can't find jobs at the higher paying schools. And then when they do get the jobs at the lesser schools, they are coming out of pocket for a lot of the materials for the kids. And, there's even less for groceries there.
Well, a good example, my son-in-law works for me. He paints, and he's a good painter. And, I pay him a reasonable salary. It's not great. He can provide for his family pretty well with what he makes. But he got his bachelor's degree in education and got a job teaching at one of the local schools here. But with the amount they paid him, they couldn't get by for the only year that he taught. They went into debt. They couldn't make it. And so he went back to work for me, which just as an individual who has thrown this paint company together, and paying him more than the state would pay him to teach at one of our schools. And to me, that's pitiful.
Yeah, that's very, very sad. I mean,
Yeah.
painting is an honorable profession, don't get me wrong.
Sure.
But we also need educators.
But let's
Education, we're way ahead of we need a good paint job on a house. And, here I am, I should be pushing, what is my income, but I'm more interested in the human race moving forward. And if we don't educate our children well, eventually we won't even need painters, because, we're just going to go downhill as a society. So to me, it's an extremely important issue.
One of the things that I've found is that people are taking not just the wrong approach, that is concerning the question of God, but people are taking the wrong approach in education, and the outcome is not good. You can take the average person here in Pensacola who graduates from high school, and it's nothing to brag about. And my point is, we could set up a classical school here in Pensacola easily, and within 5 years, you would see hundreds of students walking away from the public school simply to get into classical education, because it does such a sufficient job, if done right, in training students. Simply because, for instance, when a child goes through classical education, they're taught to parse, and what that means, they're not just going to name the parts of speech, but if they're looking at a verb, it's not just, this is a verb. They're going to have to tell me whether that's present active, indicative, first person singular, or what. They need to be able to parse as quickly as they can read the word itself. They don't need to be, can I remember? Why is parsing important? Because knowing the morphological structure of a word is very important. Because the manner in which we start, let's say, stacking, that is within the mental lexicon, that can't be understood until we deal strongly with morphology. And so we have morphology, and then we have syntax, okay? The manner in which we deal with syntax needs to be understood. Typically, it's not. And so this is why Americans have bought into the notion that let's just stay with the active voice. Now, other languages have active, middle, and passive voice, and they have varieties, namely of usages with the passive and also the middle voice. We don't have that in English. We have something similar to the middle and the passive, and so I've given that example over and over again. But my point is, if I were to ask, and I've hired I heard this lady, she had her PhD. She was an English major, and she was a good teacher. When she came to hear me teach English, she said, for the next 2 weeks, can I take my vacation? I said, I guess you just went to work here, but you want your vacation early. She said, no, I want to sit in your class. And I said, do me a favor, bring your students into my class. And she brought her students into my class, and she sat there and learned, because I was dealing with, when we talk about verbs, we need to talk about transitive, intransitive, and acquative verbs, correct?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, but let's go on to ergative verbs. What's an ergative? I mean, most people are not even challenged to think in that kind of context, nor are people even interested in understanding in principles how verbs and verbals do function. And so what I was doing, I was simply trying to get people to understand morphological data and how that, in a sense, is very telling when we put together syntax and why syntax does work. Because if you can understand how and why it works and how we have come to agree upon certain things, children don't get stuck in fixed grammar. They start functioning like Noam Chomsky talks about in this generative sense. And so they become people who are language smart instead of a parrot. And so you never want children to parrot. You want your students to learn how to think through. In other words, you provide them with information, you teach them logically how to deal with it, then you teach them how to write and speak efficiently concerning what they logically can challenge or question. Make sense?
Oh, yeah, and this is why I'm so happy that I chose to learn German when I was in high school.
Sure.
German being a strongly inflected language, not nearly as strongly inflected as, say, Greek or Latin, but you still had the cases, you still had the forms in the language that are so much more than English has. And then once I got to university and started writing computer compilers, that's when I really got into parsing of all times to do it. And that really was an eye-opener. And is it my imagination, or has American English become a lot less rich even in the last 50 years?
I think we're experiencing quite a bit of entropy. I'd like to go into, let's say, a long program about that and why, but it's suffering much in every way. But let me get back to a couple of points. For instance, if you're trying to teach a kid what prepositions are, prepositional phrases, and so on, what you want to do structurally, if you take them into Greek, for instance, there is a way to teach Greek, and you're not trying to teach Greek so much as to get all of the students to be fluent in Greek, to where they are speaking Greek every day. But one thing that Greek does, it gives you a vantage point of prepositions and verbals in a manner that you can't get so well in English. And what it does, right now English is a universal language, correct? And a universal language, a universal language doesn't need to be boxed. It needs to, gather, borrow from other languages and keep doing this so it can wrap its arms around other languages, correct? And that's why it works so well. And the reason that, Trump has a great argument, if he were smart, we don't need Spanish in America as a second language in this sense. If we had the Constitution written or law written in Spanish, what would happen in the court systems, it would go downhill, because Spanish and Latin, read classical Latin, do your homework in classical Latin. It's a very ambiguous language. When you compare that to Greek, Greek is a very exact, a very articulate language in that you don't have that many ambiguities. English is less ambiguous than Spanish. We don't need to go into Spanish, that is, as a legal system, because we have much more clarity in our language. And there is no one in linguistics who would disagree with me concerning that. And so when it comes to law, when it comes to just basic ordinary contracts, people in other countries, like in France, French, these Romance languages, they fail much in every way simply because they come from classical Latin. And my point is, if people understand what the dynamics of English and what you can do with it and what we're going to do with it now, in other words, we need to shape our students to where they can, in a sense, improve our English outcome, because if they do so, that's going to give us all the advantages that is for people all over the world, because we are becoming global in everything, correct?
Yeah, we are. And in that sense, that's one thing that I would say for Spanish as a second language here in the U.S., simply because so many people speak it. And,
Right.
and the number's growing.
Right. One of the reasons that we went to war in Iraq, and I've spoken so many times to many of the linguists from the military here in town, they didn't understand the nominal structured languages of that area. They've asked me a plethora of questions simply to learn how that works. And so you can ask the average linguist that works for the military, and what they provide to the Pentagon is typically written on about a 6th or a 7th grade level. And so our intelligence community is giving or feeding our Pentagon people things that are not, they're not egalitaric to what they are finding. In other words, the reason that, I like the book of John, but it's written in a third grade, it's written in third grade Greek. Well, in third grade Greek, it's impossible to say many things that you could say, let's say, on a university level, and you get that. And so the same thing is true when you're trying to tease out an esoteric language like we have within the various religious factions there in Iraq. And it takes, very good analysis to find out what's really going on, the intent of these authors. And what took place was that our intelligence community was not comprehending the intent. And so one of the biggest failures was our linguists didn't know enough, didn't practice good linguistics. And what our president, he didn't have a clue. He was clueless because, he's stuck in boxed grammar. That's all he knows. And so he was just swallowing anything and everything. And so we went to war, and the same thing can be said about all of these senators who voted for that war. But we violated everything that the UN stands for. We violated so many things. We should have suffered the consequences, but we didn't. Why? It's because we're the big guy and we can get away with anything that we want to, but at some point we're not going to be able to do that. So my point is, if we become a community of people dealing with language more efficiently, and if we take the universal language, English, and we make it a little bit larger than what it currently is, and that would mean to gather. Let me demonstrate what I'm talking about. Let's pretend like we have this island off the coast, okay? And this island off the coast, they have no active voice or middle voice verbs, okay? Every sentence that they use is in the passive voice. That would be a problem, correct?
There we go. Yeah,
Okay.
definitely.
Try translating everything that you say in English to a group of people who only use the passive voice.
Yeah, I mean, I'm
Okay.
a fan of the passive voice, but to do that,
It would be strange, or
Yeah.
better yet, let's go to the island of the ergative verb only speaking people. That's all they use is ergative verbs. Okay. Now, if you had to translate what we're saying tonight in English, and you had to do this through the means of what they do, that would be difficult, correct? And I'm simply
Yeah,
saying
I
that
mean-
what English has to do, it has to learn how to incorporate, that is, various cultures, various aspects of how people work, that is, with their language. And if we would do so, English would become a complex language, and it would become much more articulate to so many different ways of dealing with logic, dealing with how people think. In other words, believe it or not, people in other countries are way ahead of us in some of the disciplines simply because they look at it from a different vantage point.
Yes.
Okay? And so my point is, we'll never catch up with them until we learn how to take English and somewhat learn how to comprehend that. Does that make sense?
Oh, it do.
There you go. Okay. I'm tired. I'm hungry. I'd like to have a big chocolate donut because I would feel saved if I had a big chocolate donut, but I don't have one.
Careful with those donuts.
But Daryl, to close this show out, what's the best word to say?
Have a wonderful night.
There you go. Diana, what's your final word?
Oh, happiness and joy. Okay, that's 2 words, but
There you go.
you got my point.
I tell you what, Bob is very, very good. He was tired tonight, but he'll be back on next Sunday night. And that guy, he's amazing. I love him so much. He and I we talk a lot, and he's just a fabulous person. If you've enjoyed the show tonight, like it, invite other people to be here. We don't claim to know everything. In fact, we're probably failing in most areas. And so if I have offended you, please forgive me. I haven't intended to do so, but sometimes I misspeak, I mishear, I do all the wrong things sometimes. And so forgive me, but let's have a wonderful life together. Let's learn how to be friends, be kind, and help each other. That would be a good idea. Love you. Good night.